No one cared for the paralyzed Nootka scout until the mountain woman swore she'd die protecting him. Colorado Territory, 1876, outside the trading post at Devil's Canyon, where the autumn wind carried the scent of coming snow and the promise of a winter that would kill the weak. A man was being sold like damaged livestock. The trading post squatted against the rocky canyon wall like a scab on the landscape, its weathered wood planks grey with age and stained with the blood of countless deals made in desperation. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of whiskey, tobacco smoke, and the particular stench of men who had given up on washing weeks ago. But it was outside, in the dusty clearing behind the building, where the real ugliness was happening. A small crowd had gathered around a makeshift wagon, drawn by the kind of morbid curiosity that brought people to public hangings and bear baiting. The wagon itself was a sorry sight, one wheel held together with rope and prayer, the wooden bed scarred from years of hauling everything from ore to corpses across the unforgiving Colorado mountains. But it wasn't the wagon that held their attention. In the back, propped against a pile of moldy blankets, sat a young man who might have been 25 if the hardship hadn't aged him beyond his years. His skin was the deep copper of the Nootka people, marked with the intricate tattoos that told the story of his lineage, his exploits, his place in a world that no longer seemed to want him. But those tattoos were faded now. Like everything else about him, Talon Windspear had once been the finest scout in 3 territories, able to track a deer through solid rock and read the weather in the way a hawk circled overhead. His eyes could spot an Apache war party from 5 miles away, and his hands could follow a trail so cold that other men would have given up after the first 100 yards. The army had paid him well for those skills, and the reputation he'd built had made him a legend among the trappers and traders who worked the high country. Now those same hands lay motionless in his lap, as useless as the legs that would never again carry him across the mountain trails he knew better than his own heartbeat. The bear that had done this to him 3 months ago was long dead, killed by the same rifle that now lay broken beside him in the wagon. But the damage was permanent, his spine crushed when the grizzly had slammed him against a granite boulder, with the force of an avalanche. The man standing beside the wagon was called Jeremiah Crow, though most people knew him as a liar, a cheat, and a man who would sell his own mother if the price was right. He'd been Talon's partner on the hunting expedition that had gone wrong, the one who had convinced the scout to track the wounded bear into a box canyon where there was no escape route. Crow had been the one to suggest they could make enough money from the bear's hide to last through winter, the one who had insisted they follow the blood trail even when Talon's instincts screamed danger. "Step right up, gentlemen," Crow was saying now, his voice carrying the practiced tone of a snake oil salesman. "What we have here is one Talon Windspear, finest tracker these mountains ever produced. Course, he ain't much good for tracking anymore, seeing as how he can't feel nothing below the waist. But he's still got that knowledge up in his head, still knows every trail, every waterhole, every hiding spot from here to Denver City." A bearded prospector in the crowd spat tobacco juice into the dust. "What's the point of buying a crippled Indian? Can't scout, can't ride, can't even walk to the privy on his own. Might as well buy a broken saddle." "That's where you're wrong, friend," Crow replied, his smile revealing teeth stained brown with chewing tobacco. "See, Talon here still eats like any other man, still needs a roof over his head come winter, but he can't work for it no more. Whoever takes him gets themselves a map of these mountains that walks and talks. All you got to do is keep him fed, and listen when he tells you where the gold is hiding." Another voice from the crowd, this one belonging to a thin man with the sunken cheeks of someone who'd spent too many years breathing mine dust. "How do we know he won't just lie to us? Indians can't be trusted no more than wolves." Talon's dark eyes fixed on the speaker with a stare that had once made hardened cavalry officers reconsider their orders. There was no fear in that gaze, no pleading, just a cold assessment that suggested he was memorizing the man's face for future reference. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect through deed rather than bluster. "I have never lied to a white man who paid me honest wages," Talon said, each word measured and precise. "But I have also never forgotten a man who called me a liar when I told him the truth. You would do well to remember that. Even if you buy me like a broken horse, my memory works just fine." The thin man took a step back, something in Talon's tone suggesting that, paralyzed or not, this was not a man to be taken lightly. But Crow was already moving on, sensing the crowd's attention beginning to wander. "Now then, what am I bid for this fine specimen of mountain knowledge? Winter's coming fast, and whoever buys him is getting 20 years of experience tracking. Gold, silver, and anything else worth finding in these hills. Course, you'll need to feed him and keep him warm, but think of it as an investment in your future prosperity." An hour passed as the sun climbed higher in the October sky, and still no one had made a serious offer. The crowd had grown from curious onlookers to potential buyers, but the bidding was half-hearted at best. A few men had offered to take Talon off Crow's hands for the price of a meal and a bottle of whiskey, treating the transaction like they were doing him a favor rather than buying a human being. Talon sat through it all with the stoic dignity of a man who had faced death before and found it less humiliating than this. His weathered hands rested calmly on the blanket that covered his useless legs, and his face showed no emotion as men discussed his worth like they were appraising livestock. But those who looked closely might have noticed the way his jaw clenched. When Crow embellished the story of how he'd been injured, making it sound like carelessness rather than bad luck. "The way I heard it," Crow was telling a group of miners, "Old Talon here got overconfident, thought he could take down a full-grown grizzly with nothing but a hunting knife. Bear taught him different, and now he's learning what it means to be humble. Might be a good lesson for any man who thinks too highly of his own abilities." It was a lie, and everyone there knew it. Talon had gone into that canyon armed with a rifle, ammunition, and the kind of careful planning that had kept him alive for 25 years in country that killed unprepared men as a matter of routine. The bear had been wounded and desperate, trapped in a dead-end canyon where it had gone to die. What had happened next was the kind of accident that no amount of skill or preparation could prevent, the random violence that reminded every man on the frontier that death was always one moment of bad luck away. But Crow's version made for a better story, one that let the listeners feel superior to the broken man in the wagon. It also made Talon seem like damaged goods, a cautionary tale rather than a valuable resource. And that was exactly what Crow wanted, because a man with a reputation for invincibility was worth more money than one who had been humbled by his own mistakes. A new voice cut through the murmur of conversation, sharp and clear as a rifle. "Shot! How much for all of him?" The crowd turned to see who had spoken, and what they saw was not what they expected. The woman standing at the edge of the group was maybe 30 years old, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of hard living in the mountains. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, braided down her back in a style that was practical rather than fashionable. She wore men's clothing, buckskin pants, and a wool shirt that had seen better days, but her boots were good quality leather, and her rifle was well maintained. Most striking of all were her eyes, green as mountain pine and hard as the granite. Peaks that surrounded them. These were eyes that had seen violence and decided it was just another part of life in the high country. Eyes that measured every man in the crowd and found most of them wanting. When she looked at Talon, something passed between them. A recognition that neither had expected. "I said, how much for all of him?" she repeated, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested she'd been born somewhere back east but had chosen to make her life in the wilderness. The man, not just his knowledge. What's your price, Crow? Jeremiah Crow's eyes lit up with the kind of greed that made men do stupid things in pursuit of easy money. Here was someone with cash, someone who might actually pay a decent price for damaged goods. He looked the woman up and down, taking in her practical clothing and expensive rifle, trying to calculate how much money she might have and how much of it he could separate her from. "Well now, miss," he began, fishing for a name. "Steele," she said simply. "Willow Steele, and I'm not interested in your sales pitch. I asked for a price." Crow's smile became more genuine, though no less predatory. "Miss Steele, you're looking at 20 years of mountain experience wrapped up in one convenient package. This here is Talon Windspear, finest scout these territories ever produced. True, he's had a bit of an accident, but his mind is still sharp as a steel trap. I was thinking maybe $200 would be a fair price for such valuable merchandise." The price brought a murmur from the crowd. $200 was more money than most of these men saw in a year, enough to buy a good horse and gear to last through winter. It was also far more than anyone would pay for a paralyzed man, no matter how much knowledge he might possess. Willow Steele's expression didn't change as she considered the offer. She looked at Talon again, studying his face with the same intensity she might use to judge the quality of a horse or the accuracy of a rifle. What she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she reached into her coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of real money. $100, she said, counting out gold coins onto her palm, "and that's generous for a man who can't walk." Crow's face reddened with indignation. "Now see here, Miss Steele, this ain't some broken-down mule we're talking about. This is a man with knowledge worth its weight in gold. 200 is already a bargain." 150, Willow replied, adding a few more coins to her palm. "Final offer. Take it, or keep him through winter yourself." The mention of winter caused Crow to reconsider. Keeping Talon through. The cold months would mean feeding him, sheltering him, and dealing with the constant reminder of the expedition that had gone wrong. It would also mean facing the questions that people were already starting to ask about what had really happened in that canyon, questions that Crow was not eager to answer in detail. 150 it is, he said quickly, before anyone else could make a counteroffer, but I want it understood that all sales are final. No bringing him back if he doesn't work out. Willow nodded and handed over the money, counting it out with the quick efficiency of someone who had conducted business in rough places before. As Crow pocketed the coins, she walked over to the wagon and looked down at Talon with an expression that was impossible to read. "Can you sit a horse if someone ties you to the saddle?" she asked, her tone matter-of-fact rather than pitying. Talon met her gaze steadily. "I can sit a horse. Whether I can stay on one depends on the horse and the trail." "We'll start easy and work our way up," Willow said. She turned to address the crowd, most of whom were still staring in amazement at the transaction they had just witnessed. "Anyone got a problem with this sale?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and the hand resting casually on the butt of her pistol suggested she was prepared to back up her words with action if necessary. The men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Whatever this mountain woman's reputation might be, it was clearly sufficient to discourage casual interference. Crow, eager to complete the transaction before anyone could change. Their mind helped transfer Talon from the wagon to Willow's horse. It was an awkward process that left the scout's dignity somewhat bruised, but he endured it with the same stoic patience he had shown throughout the auction. When he was finally secured in the saddle, Willow swung up behind him, her arms encircling his waist to hold the reins. "Where are we going?" Talon asked as they rode away from the trading post. "Home," Willow replied simply. "My cabin's about 10 miles up the mountain. We'll be there before dark if the weather holds." As they disappeared into the pine forest that cloaked the lower slopes of the mountain, the crowd at the trading post began to disperse. Some headed back inside for another drink. Others mounted their horses and rode off to wherever they had come from. But more than a few lingered to discuss what they had just witnessed, trying to make sense of a mountain woman who would pay good money for a paralyzed Indian scout. That woman's got more money than sense, one prospector observed. What's she gonna do with a cripple who can't even walk to the outhouse? Maybe she's planning to use him as bait, suggested another. Indians got enemies up in those hills. Could be she figures on trading him to settle some old score. But an old-timer who had been in the territory longer than most shook his head at such speculation. You boys don't know Willow Steel like I do. That woman don't do nothing without a good reason, and she sure don't throw money around on foolish notions. If she bought that scout, it's because she's got plans for him. What kind of plans? The old man spat into the dust and adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. The kind that usually end with somebody getting killed, and it ain't usually her. The trail that led away from Devil's Canyon trading post was narrow and steep, carved into the mountainside by the feet of countless travelers over the years. Pine trees crowded close on both sides, their branches creating a green tunnel that filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The air was thin and cold, carrying the promise of snow that would come sooner rather than later this high in the Colorado Rockies. Willow Steel rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of her adult life in the saddle, her body moving naturally with the rhythm of the horse beneath her. Behind her, Talon Windspear sat stiffly, his hands gripping the saddle horn as he adjusted to the unfamiliar sensation of riding without being able to feel or control his legs. It was a humbling experience for a man who had once been able to stay mounted on the wildest Mustang, but he endured it with the same quiet dignity he had shown during the auction. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The mountain trails demanded attention, and both riders knew that a careless moment could send them tumbling down slopes that would kill a man just as dead as any bullet. But as the trail leveled out somewhat, following a ridge that offered spectacular views of the valley below, Willow finally broke the silence. "You know these mountains well?" she asked, her voice carrying easily over the sound of the horse's hooves on stone. "Better than I know my own thoughts," Talon replied. "I've been tracking through these hills since I was old enough to sit a horse alone. Every stream, every game trail, every place where a man might find shelter or water or trouble." "What about gold?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. It was the question that every white person eventually asked, the reason why men like Crow saw value in keeping him alive. Talon had learned to be careful with his answers, because knowledge of gold could be more dangerous than knowledge of where the Apache liked to set their ambushes. "I know where some has been found," he said carefully, "but most of the easy gold is already claimed or played out. What's left is either too hard to reach or too dangerous to be worth the effort." Willow nodded, as if his answer was exactly what she had expected. "That's what I figured. If there was easy money to be made up here, this mountain would be crawling with prospectors and claim jumpers. Instead, it's just me and whatever wildlife hasn't been scared off by the miners down in the valley." "You live alone?" Talon asked, surprised despite himself. The mountains were hard country for anyone, but for a woman living without protection, they could be deadly. "For the past 3 years, Willow confirmed. "Had a partner once, but he decided the gold fields in California looked more promising than the hunting and trapping up here. Turned out he was wrong about that, but by the time he figured it out, I'd gotten used to making my own decisions." There was something in her tone that suggested the departure of her partner had been more complicated than a simple disagreement about business prospects, but Talon didn't press for details. Everyone who ended up in the high country had stories they preferred not to tell, and he respected the unspoken rule that a person's past was their own business unless they chose to share it. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. Snow began to appear in patches on the north-facing slopes, and the wind carried the sharp bite of winter. Talon found himself grateful for the wool blanket Willow had wrapped around his shoulders before they left the trading post, though he said nothing about the kindness. He had learned that acknowledging charity often made people uncomfortable, as if helping him somehow diminished their own strength. The sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks when they finally reached Willow's cabin, and Talon had to admit he was impressed despite himself. The structure was built into a natural depression in the mountainside, using the stone cliff face as one wall and heavy timber for the rest. It was designed to be invisible from below and defensible from above, the kind of place where a person could hold off attackers or wait out the worst storms nature could deliver. "Built it myself," Willow said, noticing his appraisal. "Took me the better part of 2 summers, but it's solid enough to last. Roof won't leak, walls won't let in the wind, and there's a spring not 50 yards from the door. Everything a person needs to survive up here." She dismounted and began the process of helping Talon down from the horse, a task that required both strength and patience. When he was finally settled in a chair she had carried outside for the purpose, she began unsaddling the horse and settling it into a small corral that had been carved out of the natural rock formation. "Why?" Talon asked suddenly. Willow paused in her work and looked at him. "Why what? Why buy me? $150 is a lot of money for a man who can't walk. You could have hired a dozen healthy men for what you paid for one." A crippled scout. For a long moment Willow didn't answer. She finished caring for the horse, checked the water in the trough, and made sure the gate was securely latched. Only then did she turn back to face him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "Because," she said finally, "sometimes the most valuable things are the ones other people are too blind to see." The interior of Willow. Steele's cabin revealed the careful planning of someone who understood that winter in the high country was a war fought with preparation and willpower. The main room served as kitchen, workshop, and living space, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and shelves lined with preserved food, ammunition, and the tools necessary for survival at 9,000 feet above sea level. Everything had its place, and everything was built to last through the kind of storms that could trap a person for weeks at a time. Talon sat in the wooden chair where Willow had placed him, taking in details with the trained eye of a scout who had learned. That observation could mean the difference between life and death. The cabin was clean but not fancy, functional rather than comfortable, and everything he could see suggested that its owner was someone who planned for trouble and hoped she was wrong. The rifle rack near the door held 3 different weapons, each one meticulously maintained and positioned for quick access. The windows were small and placed high on the walls, offering views of the approaches while minimizing exposure to hostile fire. "You built this like a fortress," he observed as Willow moved around the cabin, lighting oil lamps against the gathering darkness. "Because sometimes it needs to be one," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "3 years ago, when I first came up here, I had some visitors who weren't interested in friendly conversation. Took me 2 days to convince them that I was serious about wanting to be left alone." Talon's eyes found the dark stains on the wooden floor near the doorway, stains that had been scrubbed but not completely eliminated. "Permanent persuasion? The kind that tends to discourage repeat visits," Willow confirmed. She pulled a pot from a shelf and began preparing what smelled like venison stew, adding dried vegetables and herbs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had cooked countless meals over an open fire. "But that's not why I brought you here. We need to talk about what happens next." For the first time since leaving the trading post, Talon felt a flicker of uncertainty. He had been purchased like livestock, transported to an isolated cabin in the mountains, And now the woman who owned him was preparing to reveal her true intentions. The possibilities ranged from slavery to torture to some form of revenge that he couldn't yet comprehend, and his inability to escape made every option equally terrifying. "I know what you're thinking," Willow said without turning from the stove. "You're wondering if I'm going to chain you to the wall and use you for target practice, or maybe sell you to someone who has a grudge against scouts who work for the army. But if I wanted you dead, there were easier ways to accomplish that without spending $150. Then what do you want?" Willow ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the rough wooden table that occupied the center of the room. She handed 1 bowl to Talon and sat down across from him, her green eyes studying his face in the flickering lamplight. When she spoke, her voice carried a seriousness that suggested she was about to reveal something important. "I want to offer you a partnership," she said simply. Talon's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "A partnership? You know these mountains better than any man alive. You can read weather patterns, animal behavior, and terrain features that would take other people years to learn. You understand how to survive in country that kills the unprepared, and you know where to find water, shelter, and game when survival depends on it." She paused to take a sip of stew, organizing her thoughts before continuing. "What you don't have anymore is mobility. You can't scout ahead, you can't escape from danger, and you can't physically defend yourself if trouble comes calling. But you still have the knowledge, and knowledge is what I need most." "Knowledge for what?" Willow stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. She opened it and withdrew a canvas-wrapped bundle, which she brought back to the table and carefully unwrapped. Inside was a hand-drawn map, but not like any map Talon had ever seen. This one showed details that no surveyor would bother to record, the kind of information that came from years of careful observation and meticulous documentation. "I've been mapping the mineral deposits in these mountains for the past 3 years, she explained, spreading the map on the table between them. "Not gold, which is what most people are looking for, but copper, silver, and iron ore. The kind of metals that will be worth real money when the railroad finally pushes through this territory." Talon studied the map with growing amazement. The level of detail was extraordinary, showing not just the location of potential mining sites, but also the accessibility of each deposit, the quality of the ore, and the infrastructure that would be required to extract it profitably. Someone had invested enormous amounts of time and effort in creating this document, and the result was potentially worth more than all the gold claims in the territory combined. "You did all this yourself?" "Every survey, every sample, every calculation," Willow confirmed, "but I'm reaching the limits of what one person can accomplish alone. There are areas I can't reach safely, terrain features I can't interpret accurately, and threats I can't evaluate properly. That's where you come in." She pointed to several unmarked areas on the map, regions that appeared to be blank, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too dangerous for a single person to explore. "These areas all have promising geological formations, but they're also Apache territory, or places where the weather can change fast enough to kill you, or terrain that requires specialized knowledge to navigate safely. I need someone who can read the signs and tell me whether the risk is worth the potential reward." Talon set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair, processing what he had just learned. The woman who had bought him like a piece of damaged goods was offering him a partnership in what could be the most valuable mining operation in the territory. It was the kind of opportunity that men spent their entire lives searching for, and she was presenting it to him as casually as she might. "Discuss the weather. What exactly are you proposing?" he asked carefully. "Full partnership," Willow replied. 50-50 split on everything we find, with the understanding that I provide the mobility and you provide the expertise. We work together to complete the survey, file the claims under both our names, and sell the mining rights to whoever is willing to pay the best price. And if I say no?" Willow's expression didn't change. "Then you say no. I'll help you get back down the mountain. Make sure you have enough money to survive the winter, and you go on with your life however you choose. But I think you're too smart to walk away from this opportunity." Talon studied the map again, his trained eye picking out details that confirmed Willow's assessment of the potential value. The mineral deposits she had identified were extensive and high-grade, located in areas that would be accessible once the railroad provided transportation infrastructure. Someone with the foresight to claim these sites now could potentially become wealthy beyond imagination when development finally reached this remote corner of the territory. But there were also risks involved that went far beyond the physical. Dangers of mountain exploration. Apache war parties still moved through these hills, looking for isolated targets they could attack without fear of immediate retaliation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weather could change from pleasant to deadly in a matter of hours, and rescue was impossible for anyone caught in the open during a blizzard. Most importantly, valuable claims attracted the kind of attention that often resulted in claim jumping, violence, and mysterious disappearances. "Why trust me?" Talon asked. "You don't know anything about me except what you observed during that auction. For all you know, I could be planning to take this information and sell it to the highest bidder." Willow smiled for the first time since they had met, an expression that transformed her weathered features and revealed the attractive woman hiding beneath the practical exterior, because your Talon windspear and your reputation was built on honor as much as skill. Every man I've talked to in the past 3 years has mentioned your name with respect, even the ones who don't much care for Indians in general. They say you never broke a contract, never betrayed a confidence, and never left a partner behind. When things got dangerous, she paused, her expression becoming serious again. But more importantly, because you understand what it means to be written off as worthless. You know how it feels to have people look at you and see only what's broken, not what's still strong. I'm betting that makes you someone I can trust to see the value in an opportunity that other people would dismiss. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, the distinctive crack of a branch breaking under someone's weight. It came from somewhere outside the cabin, close enough to be a threat, but far enough away to suggest that whoever was out there was trying to approach without being detected. Willow's hand moved instantly to the pistol at her hip, and her eyes fixed on the small window that offered a view of the approach trail. "How many?" Talon whispered, his own senses straining to gather information despite his physical limitations. "Can't tell yet," Willow replied, her voice barely audible. "Could be an animal, but the spacing of the sound suggests human movement. Careful, deliberate, like someone who knows what they're doing." She moved to the rifle rack and selected a Winchester. Repeater, checking the action with practiced efficiency before positioning herself at the window. The view was limited by the darkness outside, but Talon could see her eyes tracking movement that he couldn't detect from his position at the table. 3 men, she reported after a long moment of observation. Coming up the trail single file, armed with rifles, moving like they know exactly where they're going. This isn't a chance encounter. Talon felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once prepared him for combat, but now served only to remind him of his helplessness. In the old days, he would have been moving to a defensive position, checking his weapons and planning escape routes. Now, he could only sit and watch while someone else fought the battle that his knowledge might have helped prevent. "Is there another way out?" he asked. "Back window leads to a ledge that connects to a game trail," Willow replied, "but it's too narrow for your chair, and the drop is about 30 feet to the rocks below. Not an option, unless we want to guarantee you don't survive. The sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, and Talon could hear the low murmur of voices as the intruders communicated with each other. He couldn't make out individual words, but the tone suggested men who were confident in their ability to handle whatever resistance they might encounter. 3 armed men against 1 woman and a paralyzed scout were odds that heavily favored the attackers. A voice called out from the darkness, loud enough to carry clearly through the cabin walls. "Willow Steel, we know you're in there, and we know you ain't alone. We seen the horse tracks, and we counted 2 riders coming up the trail. No point pretending you're not home." Willow positioned herself where she could see the front approach, while remaining in cover. "What do you want, Morrison?" she called back, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Just want to talk, Willow. Been hearing some interesting stories about the work you've been doing up here, mapping and surveying and such. Thought maybe we could discuss a business proposition that might benefit all of us." "I'm not interested in partners, Morrison. You know that." A different voice joined the conversation, this one with a harder edge that suggested violence was a more appealing option than negotiation. "Maybe you'll be more interested when you hear what we're offering, or when you consider what might happen if you're not interested." Talon recognized the tone, if not the voice. He had heard it countless times during his years of military service. The sound of men who were prepared to use force to get what they wanted and were only going through the motions of civilized conversation because it amused them. These were not people who would be satisfied with polite refusal. "Willow," he said quietly, "these men aren't here to negotiate. They're here to take what they want, and they're only talking because they want to get inside the cabin without having to break down the door." She nodded, without taking her eyes off the window. "I know, but as long as they're talking, they're not shooting. And as long as they're not shooting, I've got time to figure out how to kill all 3 of them without getting us both murdered in the process." The negotiations continued for another 10 minutes, with Morrison and his companions gradually revealing more about their true intentions. They had been watching Willow's activities for months, documenting her surveying work and following her movements around the mountain. They knew about the mineral deposits she had discovered, and they wanted a share of any claims she might file. More importantly, they wanted the map that detailed everything she had learned. "You see, Willow," Morrison explained in the patient tone of someone talking to a stubborn child, "we ain't unreasonable men. We're willing to offer you a fair partnership, maybe 20% of whatever we find. That's generous, considering you'll be doing a lot less of the dangerous work from now on." 20% of my own discoveries? Willow's voice carried a note of incredulous anger. "That's not a partnership, Morrison. That's robbery with a thin coat of legal paint." "Legal don't matter much up here in the mountains," the third voice observed. "What matters is who's got the most guns and the will to use them. Right now, that would be us." Talon could see the tactical situation developing with the clarity that had once made him valuable to cavalry commanders. The attackers had positioned themselves to cover all the obvious escape routes, and they were gradually moving closer to the cabin under cover of the ongoing conversation. Soon they would be close enough to rush the building, and once they were inside, superior numbers would quickly decide the outcome. But they had also made several mistakes that a more experienced opponent might have avoided. They were bunched too closely together, making them vulnerable to a single well-placed shot. They had approached from the most obvious direction, failing to scout alternative routes that might have given them better tactical advantage. Most importantly, they were assuming that their opponents would behave like typical civilians rather than people with military training and mountain survival experience. "Willow," Talon said quietly, "do you trust me?" She glanced at him quickly before returning her attention to the window. "With what?" "With your life. Because I think I can get us out of this, but it's going to require you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, without question or hesitation." For a moment she studied his face in the lamplight, weighing whatever she saw there against. The desperate nature of their situation. Then she nodded once, sharply. "Tell me what you need." "First, put out all the lamps except the one on the table. Make it look like we're settling in for the night, maybe getting ready to surrender. Then get me that rifle and position my chair so I can cover the front door." Willow moved quickly to comply, extinguishing the oil lamps one by one until only a single flame remained to illuminate the interior of the cabin. The reduction in light would make it harder for the attackers to see inside, while improving the defenders' ability to spot movement in the darkness outside. "Now what?" she whispered, helping him position the rifle across his lap. "Now you're going to create a distraction that will draw at least two of them to the back of the cabin. Can you make it to that rear window without being seen?" "If I stay low and move carefully." "What kind of distraction?" Talon's smile was grim with anticipation, the kind that makes them think we're trying to escape. Throw something heavy out the back window, make some noise, maybe fire a shot into the air. When they move to investigate, I'll take care of whoever stays to watch the front door. It was a desperate plan that depended on split-second timing and the assumption that their attackers would react predictably to an apparent escape attempt. But it was also their only realistic chance of survival, and both of them knew that hesitation would only make their situation worse. "On my signal," Talon whispered, settling the rifle into a comfortable firing position despite the awkwardness of his seated position. 3, 2, 1, go! Willow moved like a shadow toward the rear of the cabin, staying below the level of the windows and avoiding the areas where floorboards might creak under her weight. Talon watched the front approach, through the narrow gap in the curtains, tracking the barely visible shapes of the men positioned outside. When Willow reached the back window, she paused for a moment to gather herself before executing the plan they had discussed. The crash of breaking glass and splintering wood echoed through the mountain air as Willow hurled a wooden stool through the rear window, followed immediately by the sharp crack of her pistol firing into the darkness. The sounds carried clearly in the thin air, and the response was immediate. Two of the attackers broke from their positions and rushed toward the back of the cabin, their boots pounding on the rocky ground as they moved to cut off what they assumed was an escape attempt. But Morrison stayed where he was, crouched behind a boulder that gave him a clear view of the front door. He was too experienced to fall for such an obvious diversion, and he kept his rifle trained on the cabin's main entrance while his companions investigated the disturbance. It was exactly what Talon had hoped for, the separation of forces that would allow him to deal with the threats one at a time rather than facing all three simultaneously. The front door of the cabin was heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands, built to withstand both weather and hostile force. But it also had a fundamental weakness that Morrison couldn't see from his position outside. The hinges were on the interior side of the door, and the bolt that secured it could be withdrawn silently if someone was careful enough to avoid creating noise that might alert a watcher. Talon had positioned his chair so that he had a clear line of sight through the doorway. Once it was opened, and the rifle in his lap was loaded with cartridges that would punch through body armor at this range. All he needed was for Morrison to make the mistake of assuming that the defenders were focused on the rear of the cabin rather than watching all approaches equally. The mistake came sooner than expected, as the sounds of his companions crashing through the underbrush behind the cabin grew louder. Morrison rose from his concealed position and moved toward the front door. He was still being careful, keeping his rifle ready and scanning for threats, but his attention was divided between the door in front of him and the commotion behind the building. Talon slowly withdrew the bolt that secured the door, timing the movement to coincide with a particularly loud crash from the rear of the cabin. The heavy door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing Morrison's silhouette against the starlit sky. For a moment, The two men stared at each other across 20 feet of empty space, each recognizing the deadly nature of the situation they had created. Morrison's rifle was already rising toward firing position when Talon's shot took him in the chest, the heavy bullet spinning him around and dropping him to the rocky ground outside the cabin. The sound of the shot echoed off the surrounding cliffs, and Talon was already working the rifle's action to chamber another round when the remaining attackers came charging around the corners of the building. But Willow was ready for them. She had used the distraction of Morrison's death to position herself where she could cover both approaches to the rear of the cabin, and her Winchester spoke twice in rapid succession. Both men dropped within seconds of each other, their weapons falling from lifeless hands to clatter on the stones. Silence returned to the mountain clearing, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of a night bird. Talon kept his rifle trained on the front approach, while Willow checked the bodies to make sure the threat had been eliminated completely. When she returned to the cabin, her face was grim with the knowledge of what the attack had represented. "Morrison was carrying this," she said, holding up a folded piece of paper. "Looks like a copy of part of my map, enough detail to show the locations of the most valuable deposits. Someone's been watching me for longer than I thought." Talon examined the paper by lamplight, noting the precision of the copying and the professional quality of the draftsmanship. "This wasn't drawn by some random claim jumper. Whoever made this copy had access to your original map, or they spent a lot of time and effort recreating it from observation. Which means there are more of them," Willow concluded. "Morrison and his friends were just the advance party. Someone sent them to test my defenses and see how serious I was about protecting my claims." The implications were sobering. They had won this particular battle, but the war for control of the mineral deposits was just beginning. Morrison's employers would eventually come looking for their missing men, and when they did, they would be better prepared and more heavily armed. The isolated cabin that had seemed like a perfect base of operations was now a trap that could be sprung at any time. "We need to leave," Talon said. "Tonight, before whoever sent Morrison realizes that their men aren't coming back." Willow nodded, already moving to gather the supplies they would need for travel. "There's an old mining camp about 15 miles north of here, abandoned but still defensible. We can hole up there while we figure out our next move." As they prepared to abandon the cabin that had been Willow's home for 3 years, Talon found himself thinking about the partnership she had offered him just hours earlier. The attack had proven that her assessment of the situation was accurate. The mineral deposits she had discovered were valuable enough to kill for, and the knowledge he possessed was the key to exploiting them safely. But it had also demonstrated something else, something that neither of them had spoken aloud. They made a good team. His tactical knowledge and her practical skills had combined to create a defensive capability that was greater than the sum of its parts. If they could survive long enough to develop that partnership, they might actually have a chance of claiming the wealth that the mountains held. But first, they had to stay alive long enough to file the claims. "Ready?" Willow asked, shouldering. "A pack that contained her most essential possessions." Talon nodded from his position in the chair she had rigged to make transport easier. "Let's go find out what we're really worth." The darkness before sunrise was absolute in the high mountains, where the canopy of pine trees blocked even starlight from reaching the narrow trail that wound through the wilderness. Willow Steele moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had traveled these paths countless times, leading her horse by the reins, while Talon Windspear rode in the specially rigged saddle she had constructed during their hurried departure from the cabin. The contraption was crude but effective, using leather straps and wooden supports to keep him secure while allowing his hands to remain free for the rifle he carried across his lap. They had been traveling for 6 hours, moving slowly to avoid detection, and carefully covering their tracks whenever the terrain allowed. Behind them, the cabin that had been Willow's home for 3 years was now nothing more than a cold pile of ashes, deliberately burned to deny shelter to anyone who might follow. The smoke would be visible for miles once the sun came up, but by then they would be deep enough in the wilderness to make pursuit extremely difficult. How much farther to this mining camp? Talon asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the soft sounds of the horses' hooves on the rocky trail. "Another 2 hours if we maintain this pace," Willow replied. "But we need to stop soon and rest the horse. She's been carrying double. Wait for too long, and these mountain trails are hard enough on fresh animals." As if summoned by her words, a clearing appeared ahead of them, a small meadow surrounded by towering pines that would provide both concealment and grazing for their mount. Willow led them off the main trail and into the shelter of the trees, where she began the process of unsaddling the horse and setting up a temporary camp. The work was done in near silence, both of them acutely aware that sound carried far in. The thin mountain air. While Willow tended to the horse, Talon remained in his chair and studied the map she had entrusted to his care. The document was even more remarkable than he had first realized, showing not just the location of mineral deposits, but also detailed information about water sources, defensive positions, and escape routes throughout the region. Someone had invested years of careful observation and meticulous documentation in creating this resource, and the result was potentially worth more than entire towns in less isolated territories. "You realize what you've created here?" he said when Willow joined him beside the small fire she had built using dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. "A target painted on my back," she replied, settling down on a fallen log and accepting the cup of coffee he had prepared from their limited supplies. "Every claim jumper, land grabber, and corporate mining outfit in the territory is going to want a piece of this once word gets out. Then why create it at all? Why not just file claims on 1 or 2 sites and keep the rest secret?" Willow was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as she organized her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of old pain that suggested the answer was more complicated than simple greed. "Because I made a promise to someone who isn't around to see it kept. And because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to finish what they started." The fire crackled softly as Willow began to tell the story that explained everything about the map, the cabin, and the determination that had driven her to spend 3 years alone in the mountains. It was a story that began 5 years earlier when she had been married to a geological engineer named Thomas Steele, who had come west to work for one of the large mining corporations based in Denver. "Tom was brilliant," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He could look at a rock formation and tell you not just what kind of ore it might contain, but how much effort it would take to extract it profitably. The companies loved him because he could save them thousands of dollars by identifying worthless claims before they invested in development." Thomas had been working for Consolidated Mining when he discovered something that changed everything. During a routine survey in the Colorado Rockies, he had identified mineral deposits that were far more extensive and valuable than anyone had suspected. The problem was that most of these deposits were located in areas that Consolidated didn't control, and the company's solution was to use violence and intimidation to drive out the current claim holders. "Tom tried to resign when he realized what they were planning," Willow continued. "He thought he could just walk away and let someone else worry about the moral implications. But Consolidated had too much invested in his expertise to let him go that easily." The confrontation had taken place in a Denver hotel room, where representatives of the mining company had made it clear that Thomas's continued health depended on his continued cooperation. They wanted him to provide detailed maps of all the valuable sites he had identified, and they wanted him to personally oversee the process of acquiring those sites by whatever means necessary. When he refused, they had given him 24 hours to reconsider. He came home that night and told me everything, Willow said. We packed what we could carry and left Denver before dawn, planning to disappear somewhere in California where Consolidated couldn't find us. But Tom had already started copying his survey notes, trying to preserve the information in case someone honest ever wanted to develop those sites legitimately. The pursuit had caught up with them 3 days later, on a remote mountain trail. Not 50 miles from where they now sat, professional killers hired by Consolidated had tracked them down and made it clear that they had no intention of taking Thomas back alive. The resulting gunfight had left 2 corporate agents dead, but Thomas had taken a bullet in the chest that proved fatal despite Willow's desperate attempts to save him. He died in my arms, asking me to promise that I would finish the map and make sure the information got to people who would use it honestly, she said. I've been working on that promise ever since, trying to complete the survey he started and figure out how to get the claims filed without ending up dead like he did. Talon listened to the story with growing understanding of the forces they were facing. Consolidated Mining was not just another corporate competitor. It was an organization with the resources and ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened their interests. The attack on Willow's cabin had not been the work of random claim jumpers. It had been a carefully planned operation designed to acquire Thomas's survey data and eliminate the witnesses who could testify to the company's criminal activities. Morrison and his men were working for Consolidated, he said. It was not a question, almost certainly. The timing was too convenient, and they knew too much about my activities to be independent operators. Someone has been watching me for months, documenting my movements and waiting for the right moment to make their move. Which means they know about the mining camp we're heading toward. Willow nodded grimly. Probably. But it's also the only defensible position within 50 miles, and we need time to plan our next move. Sometimes you have to choose between bad options and worse ones. The old mining camp appeared through the trees just as the sun was reaching its zenith, casting long shadows across a collection of weathered buildings that had been abandoned. When the easily accessible silver played out 5 years earlier, the main shaft descended into the mountain at a steep angle, supported by heavy timber that had been cut from the surrounding forest. Around it, the remains of the mining operation lay scattered like the bones of some massive beast, rusted machinery and collapsed structures that spoke of dreams abandoned when the reality of mountain mining proved too expensive to sustain. Perfect, Talon observed as they approached the camp. Defensible position with multiple escape routes, and anyone trying to attack uphill is going to be at a severe disadvantage. Willow nodded, guiding their horse toward the most intact of the remaining buildings. Tom and I spent a week here. During his original survey, the mine shaft goes down about 300 feet before it hits the water table, and there are side tunnels that connect to natural cave systems. If we need to disappear, we can go underground and come out miles away. They spent the next hour exploring the camp and assessing its defensive potential. The main building had been constructed as a combination office and residence for the mine supervisor, with thick walls and small windows that could be easily defended. The mine shaft itself was equipped with a steam-powered hoist that could still be operated manually, providing access to the underground tunnels that might serve as escape routes if surface defenses were overrun. But it was in the supervisor's office that they made the discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a false panel in the desk drawer, they found a leather portfolio containing documents that revealed the true scope of Consolidated Mining's operations in the territory. Thomas's survey notes were there, along with correspondence between company officials that detailed their plans for acquiring mineral rights through intimidation, violence, and murder. "This is evidence," Willow said, studying the documents, with growing excitement. "Proof that Consolidated has been systematically murdering claim holders and stealing their properties. If we can get this to the territorial authorities, we can bring down the entire operation." Talon was less optimistic about the potential for legal justice. "Assuming the territorial authorities aren't already in Consolidated's pocket, these mining companies have enough money to buy judges, sheriffs, and politicians. Evidence doesn't matter much when the people who are supposed to enforce the law are being paid to look the other way." "Then what do you suggest?" "We use what we know to level the playing field. Consolidated thinks they're hunting a lone woman and a crippled scout who are trying to file mining claims. They don't know that we have access to their internal documents and detailed knowledge of their criminal activities. That gives us advantages they won't be expecting." As evening approached, they settled into the supervisor's office and began planning their response to the threats they faced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The portfolio they had discovered contained detailed information about Consolidated's operations, including the names of their agents, the locations of their hidden assets, and the methods they used to eliminate competition. It was a treasure trove of intelligence that could be used to turn the tables on an organization that had grown overconfident through years of unopposed success. "Look at this," Willow said, pointing to a particular document that detailed Consolidated's financial arrangements. "They're financing their land acquisition program through a series of loans secured by properties they don't actually own yet. If those properties suddenly became unavailable, or if their ownership was challenged in court, the entire financial structure would collapse." Talon studied the financial records with the same attention he had once devoted to analyzing enemy troop movements. The pattern that emerged was both elegant and vulnerable, a complex web of interdependent transactions that could be disrupted at multiple points. Consolidated had grown so confident in their ability to acquire properties through intimidation that they had built their entire expansion plan on the assumption that resistance was impossible. "They've overextended themselves," he concluded. "All we need to do is file legitimate claims on a few key properties and challenge their ownership in court. Even if they eventually win, the legal delays will be enough to trigger default on their loans. But filing claims means going to the territorial courthouse in Denver, which is exactly what they're expecting us to do. They'll have people watching every approach to the city, and we'll be walking into a trap." "Not if we don't go to Denver," Talon replied. "Look at this section of the territorial mining law. Claims can be filed at any official territorial office, including temporary offices established for remote areas. And according to this newspaper clipping, there's a territorial representative scheduled to visit the trading post at Devil's Canyon next week." The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of traveling to Denver and walking into Consolidated's trap, they could file their claims at the temporary office that would be established at the trading post where Talon had been auctioned just days earlier. The filing would be completely legal and binding, but it would happen in a location where Consolidated wouldn't be expecting it. "There's just one problem," Willow pointed out. "Devil's Canyon is 40 miles from here, through territory that Consolidated almost certainly has under surveillance. Getting there without being detected is going to require more than just careful travel." "Leave that to me," Talon said. "I know these mountains better than anyone they're likely to have tracking us. If we time it right and use the routes that only the Nootka know about, we can reach Devil's Canyon without being seen by anyone." That night, as they settled into the abandoned mining camp that would serve as their temporary base, both of Them understood that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. What had begun as a business partnership between a desperate woman and a man with nothing left to lose had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. They were no longer just allies of convenience. They were partners in the truest sense of the word, each bringing unique strengths to a shared struggle against overwhelming odds. "Talon," Willow said as they sat by the fire that warmed the supervisor's office, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. When you agreed to this partnership, was it because you believed in the potential for profit, or because you had nothing else left to live for?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. It was the kind of inquiry that demanded complete honesty, the sort of conversation that could either strengthen a relationship or destroy it entirely. Talon was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his answer, but the reasons why she might be asking. "Both," he said finally. "When you bought me at that auction, I was ready to die. Not actively suicidal, but just tired of fighting for a place in a world that didn't want me. The partnership you offered gave me a reason to keep going, something to work toward that was bigger than just surviving another day." He paused, organizing his thoughts before continuing. "But somewhere between the cabin and here, that changed. This isn't just about the money anymore, or even about getting revenge on the people who killed your husband. It's about proving that two people who everyone else has written off can accomplish something that matters." Willow nodded slowly, as if his answer had confirmed something she had already suspected. "I asked because I need to know whether you'll stay when this gets really dangerous. And it will get dangerous, probably more dangerous than anything either of us has faced before. Consolidated isn't going to give up just because we file a few mining claims. I know, they're going to try to kill us, and they're going to keep trying until either we're dead or they are. There won't be any middle ground, no negotiated settlement, no walking away if things get too difficult. Once we file those claims, we're committed to seeing this through to the end, whatever that end might be." Talon met her eyes across the firelight, seeing in them the same determination that had driven her to spend 3 years alone in the mountains completing her dead husband's work. She was offering him something that he had thought was lost forever, the chance to be part of something meaningful, something worth the risk of dying to achieve. "I'll stay," he said simply. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I choose to be." The fire burned lower as the night deepened, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the abandoned office. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow from the higher peaks. It was the kind of night that reminded anyone who lived in the high country that winter was coming, and with it, the isolation that could trap people for months at a time. Willow stood and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky that seemed close enough to touch at this altitude. When she spoke, her voice carried a formality that suggested she was about to make some kind of declaration. "Talon Windspear," she said, using his full name in the way that his own people did when something important was being discussed. "I want to make you a promise, and I want you to understand what it means." She turned from the window to face him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight with an intensity that commanded attention. "Tomorrow we start down a path that will probably get us both killed. But if we somehow survive, if we manage to defeat Consolidated and claim the wealth that Tom died for, I will make sure that you receive exactly half of everything we gain." You don't need to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "Because that's not the promise I'm making. The promise is this. From this moment forward, your life is as important to me as my own. I will defend you with everything I have, and I will die before I let anyone harm you because of our partnership." The words carried the weight of a sacred vow, the kind of commitment that bound people together in ways that legal contracts never could. Talon understood that she was offering him something that went far beyond business partnership or even friendship. She was making him family, accepting him as someone worth protecting at any cost. "In my culture," he said slowly, "when someone makes a vow like that, it creates a bond that cannot be broken by death or distance or time. Are you sure you understand what you're offering?" "I understand perfectly. The question is whether you're willing to accept it." Talon was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what she was proposing. In accepting her vow, he would be committing himself not just to their business partnership, but to a relationship that would define the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. It was the kind of decision that could not be made lightly or reversed. Once the words were spoken, "I accept," he said finally, "and I offer the same vow in return. Your life is as sacred to me as my own, and I will defend it with everything I have until my last breath." They clasped hands across the space between them, sealing the commitment with the ancient formality that both of their cultures recognized as binding. In that moment, something changed in the very air around them, as if the mountain itself had witnessed and approved of the bond they had created. As the fire died down to glowing embers, they settled into their bedrolls with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new dangers and challenges. But they would face those challenges together, bound by something stronger than fear or greed or desperation. They had found in each other the kind of partnership that could move mountains, and they were about to put that partnership to the ultimate test. The sound that woke them was wrong, a rhythmic metallic clanking that had no business echoing through the abandoned mining camp at sunrise. Talon's eyes snapped open first, his military training instantly alert to the intrusion of human activity in a place that should have been silent except for wind and wildlife. Beside him, Willow was already reaching for her rifle, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned that survival often depended on the speed of one's response to unexpected sounds. "Steam engine," Talon whispered, identifying the source of the mechanical noise that was growing steadily louder. "Coming. Up the main trail, maybe 2 miles out. Heavy equipment, probably a mining survey crew." Willow crept to the window and peered through a gap in the boards they had used to reinforce their defensive position. The sight that greeted her was exactly what they had feared, but hoped to avoid for at least another few days. A column of men on horseback was approaching the camp, led by a steam-powered wagon that carried what appeared to be surveying equipment and enough supplies for an extended operation. "Consolidated," she confirmed, her voice tight with controlled. "Anger. I count 12 men, all armed, moving like they own the place. They're not here to negotiate." The implications were immediate and terrifying. Somehow Consolidated Mining had tracked them to the abandoned camp despite their careful efforts to cover their trail. Either their pursuit capabilities were far more sophisticated than expected, or someone with intimate knowledge of the territory was providing intelligence to their corporate enemies. Talon was already moving, transferring himself from his bedroll to the specialized chair that Willow had constructed for mobility within the confines of the building. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked his weapons and organized the ammunition they had stockpiled for exactly this kind of emergency. The sacred vow they had exchanged the night before was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. "How long before they reach the perimeter?" he asked, settling his rifle across his lap and positioning himself where he could cover the main approach to their building. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if they stop to scout the area first," Willow replied. She was gathering their most essential supplies, stuffing the portfolio of consolidated documents and her geological maps into a waterproof pack that could be carried during a fighting retreat. "But we can't stay here and fight them off. 12 armed men against 2 defenders is suicide." The steam engine's whistle echoed off the surrounding cliffs as the consolidated force approached the outer edge of the mining camp, the shrill sound serving as both a signal to coordinate their advance and a psychological weapon designed to intimidate their quarry. Talon recognized the tactic from his military experience, the deliberate creation of noise and chaos to mask the actual positions and movements of attacking forces. "They're splitting up," he reported, watching the approaching riders through a carefully concealed observation port. 6 men coming straight up the main trail, 3 more circling to the east and 3 to the west. Classic pincer movement designed to prevent escape. Willow finished securing their emergency supplies and moved to join him at the observation point. The tactical situation was developing exactly as they had feared, with consolidated superior numbers allowing them to control all the obvious escape routes while maintaining overwhelming firepower at the point of attack. "The mine shaft has a secondary entrance," she said, pointing toward a barely visible opening in the cliff face about 200 yards from their current position. "It's an old ventilation tunnel that connects to the main passage about 50 feet down. If we can reach it without being seen, we can get underground while they're focused on the main assault." The plan was desperate and dangerous, requiring them to move across terrain that offered minimal concealment while avoiding detection by 12 armed men who were actively hunting them. But it was also their only realistic chance of survival, and both of them understood that hesitation would only make their situation worse. "I can't move fast enough in this chair," Talon said, acknowledging the tactical reality that his physical limitations imposed on any escape attempt. "You go. Take the documents and the maps, file the claims at Devil's Canyon, and make sure Consolidated pays for what they've done." Willow's response was immediate and fierce. "We made a vow last night. We face this together or not at all." The sound of approaching horses was growing closer when Willow revealed the solution she had been working on since they first arrived at the mining camp. Hidden beneath a canvas tarp in the corner of the supervisor's office was a crude but functional sledge constructed from mining equipment and designed to allow rapid transport of an injured person over rough terrain. "How long have you been planning this?" Talon asked as she helped him transfer from his chair to the sledge. "Since the moment we arrived. I told you last night that your life is as important to me as my own. That means I plan for contingencies that keep both of us alive." The car. Improvised transport system worked better than either of them had expected, allowing Willow to pull Talon across the rough ground at a pace that was actually faster than he could have managed in his chair. They reached the secondary mine entrance just as the first shots rang out from the direction of the supervisor's office, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the surrounding cliffs. "Down we go," Willow said, securing a rope around Talon's waist and beginning the careful process of lowering him into the ventilation shaft. The opening was barely wide enough to accommodate the sledge, and the descent was steep enough to be dangerous even under ideal circumstances. The underground passages were even more extensive than Willow's description had suggested, a maze of tunnels and natural caverns that connected in ways that defied easy mapping. The air was cold and damp, carrying the metallic scent of mineral deposits and the musty odor of places that had not seen sunlight for millions of years. "This way," Willow whispered, consulting her husband's hand-drawn map by the light of a carefully shielded lantern. "The main passage runs northeast for about 2 miles before it reaches the underground river. If we can follow the watercourse, it will take us all the way to the valley on the other side of the mountain." The sounds of their pursuers echoed through the mine workings with amplified intensity, voices and footsteps distorted by the acoustic properties of stone tunnels into an ominous chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Consolidated's men had discovered the mine entrances faster than expected, and they were already beginning the dangerous process of searching the underground passages. "They know the territory," Talon observed, listening to the coordinated sounds of the search effort. Someone's been down here before, probably mapping the tunnels as part of their plan to acquire the mining claims. This isn't a desperate chase, it's an organized manhunt. Willow paused in her navigation to consider the implications of his assessment. If Consolidated had prior knowledge of the underground passages, then their escape route was potentially compromised at multiple points. The corporate forces might already have men positioned at the major exit points. "There's another option," she said, studying her husband's notes more carefully. "Tom documented a passage that connects to the old Apache cave system about a mile from here. It's dangerous, unstable rock and underground water, but it leads to places that aren't on any white man's map." The decision to abandon their planned route and venture into truly unknown territory was not made lightly. The Apache caves were legendary among the mountain tribes, sacred places that had been used for ceremonies and refuge for countless generations. They were also notoriously dangerous, with unstable rock formations and underground rivers that could trap the unwary. But they were also the one place where Talon's knowledge of Nootka survival techniques and his understanding of tribal territorial markers might provide an advantage that their pursuers could not match. "The Apache caves," Talon agreed. "It's our best chance." The passage that led to the Apache cave system was barely wide enough for the sledge, requiring them to move in single file through a tunnel that seemed to have been carved by flowing water over geological ages. As they descended deeper into the mountain, the character of the underground environment began to change in ways that suggested they were entering a place that had been shaped by human hands as well as natural forces. The walls bore markings that Talon recognized as Apache symbols, territorial markers and spiritual signs that warned outsiders away from sacred ground. These were not casual graffiti, but formal declarations of ownership and spiritual significance that carried the weight of tribal law. "We need to be careful here," he warned Willow, as they approached a chamber where multiple passages converged. "This is a holy place for the Apache people. If we're discovered here by the wrong people, it could start a war that would make our problems with Consolidated seem trivial." The chamber they entered was magnificent in its natural beauty, a cathedral-like space where underground streams had carved soaring arches and delicate columns from the living rock. But it was also clearly a place of ceremony and reverence, marked with tribal symbols and artifacts that spoke of generations of spiritual practice. At the center of the chamber, they found something that stopped them both in their tracks. Carved into a natural stone altar were symbols that Talon recognized as being much older than the Apache markings, ancient pictographs that spoke of the original inhabitants of these mountains. The sound of approaching voices echoed through the passage they had just traversed, growing closer with each passing moment. Consolidated's men had followed their trail into the sacred caves, violating not just the sanctity of a holy place, but also risking the kind of tribal retaliation that could escalate their corporate land grab into open warfare. But as they prepared to continue their flight through the underground passages, Talon made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind the carved altar, concealed in a natural recess that was invisible from most angles, was a cache of weapons and supplies that had been placed there recently. The equipment was modern and well-maintained, including rifles, ammunition, and survival gear. Apache warriors, he realized, examining the markings on the weapon stocks. They've been fighting Consolidated too, hitting their survey teams and sabotaging their equipment. We're not the only ones who want to stop their expansion into these mountains. The implications were staggering. If the Apache tribes were already at war with Consolidated mining, then their own struggle was part of a larger conflict that involved not just corporate greed, but also the fundamental question of who had the right to determine the future of the mountain territories. Willow studied the weapons cache with growing excitement. If we could make contact with the Apache fighters, combine our knowledge of Consolidated's plans with their knowledge of the territory and their willingness to use force, we might actually have a chance of winning this war. The sound of pursuing voices was getting closer, but now it carried a different significance. If Consolidated's men entered the sacred caves and discovered the Apache weapons cache, they would have evidence of tribal involvement that they could use to justify even more extreme measures. "We can't let them find this place," Talon said, making a decision that would commit them to a course of action far more dangerous than anything they had considered before. "And we can't run anymore. It's time to stop being hunted and start doing some hunting of our own." The Apache warriors emerged from the deeper passages like shadows given substance, moving with the fluid silence that had made their people legendary among both enemies and allies. There were 6 of them, all young men marked with the traditional symbols of their warrior society and armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and modern firearms. Their leader was a man perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The initial confrontation was tense, with weapons raised on both sides and the very real possibility that misunderstanding could lead to bloodshed in a place where violence would be both sacrilegious and strategically disastrous. But Talon's knowledge of tribal protocols and his ability to communicate in the mixture of sign language and spoken words that served as a common tongue among the mountain peoples allowed him to establish their peaceful intentions. "We are enemies of the mining company," he explained, using the formal gestures that accompanied serious negotiations. "They hunt us because we have knowledge that threatens their plans to steal the sacred mountains." The Apache leader, who introduced himself as Running Wolf, listened to their story with the patient attention of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information. When Willow produced the portfolio of corporate documents, his interest became intense and focused. "These papers show the mining company's plans for all the sacred places," Running Wolf said, after examining the documents carefully. "They want to dig up the burial grounds, poison the water, and drive out all the people who remember the old ways. This cannot be allowed." The alliance that formed in the sacred cave was born of mutual necessity and shared purpose, but it was also something deeper than a mere partnership of convenience. Both groups had been written off as obstacles to progress, dismissed as remnants of a past that modern civilization was determined to sweep away. "What do you propose?" Willow asked, addressing the question to both Talon and Running Wolf. "We stop running," Talon replied. "We make Consolidated come to us on ground of our choosing, and we show them what happens when they threaten people who have nothing left to lose." Running Wolf's smile was sharp as a blade edge. "The mining company thinks they are hunting rabbits. Time to show them they are hunting wolves." The territorial representative had arrived at Devil's Canyon exactly as scheduled, his official wagon bearing the territorial seal and flying the flag that marked him as a legitimate government authority. Judge Samuel Crawford was a man in his 50s who had spent most of his career traveling between remote settlements, bringing the machinery of civilization to places where the nearest courthouse was hundreds of miles away. He had seen enough frontier justice to appreciate the value of legal procedure, and enough violence to understand when law was the only thing standing between order and chaos. What he had not expected was to find himself in the middle of a war between a mining corporation and an alliance of displaced people who seemed determined to fight for something more valuable than gold or silver. The claims that Talon Windspear and Willow Steel wanted to file were technically legal and properly documented, but the circumstances surrounding their presentation suggested complications that went far beyond routine paperwork. "These mineral surveys are extraordinarily detailed," Judge Crawford observed, studying the geological maps that Willow had spread across the trading post's rough wooden table. The level of documentation here represents years of professional work. I have to ask how you came to possess such comprehensive information about territorial mineral deposits." Willow exchanged a glance with Talon before answering. They had discussed this moment during their journey from the sacred caves, knowing that the truth might complicate their legal position, but also understanding that lies could be more dangerous than honesty when dealing with a territorial judge who had survived decades of frontier politics. The surveys were conducted by my late husband, Thomas Steele, who was a geological engineer working for Consolidated Mining, she said. When he discovered that the company was planning to use violence and intimidation to acquire these claims illegally, he tried to resign. They killed him for it. Judge Crawford's expression sharpened with interest. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Steele. Do you have evidence to support such a claim?" The portfolio of consolidated documents was produced and laid out for the judge's examination, each piece of correspondence and financial record carefully organized to tell the story of corporate conspiracy and murder. Crawford read through the materials with the careful attention of someone who understood that what he was seeing could have implications far beyond a simple mining dispute. "If these documents are authentic," he said finally, "they constitute evidence of criminal conspiracy, fraud, and murder. This goes well beyond my authority as a territorial claims adjudicator. This is a matter for federal marshals and criminal courts." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the legal proceedings, but this time the riders were not trying to conceal their approach. A column of at least 20 armed men was riding openly toward the trading post, led by a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. Behind him rode the kind of professional gunman that mining companies hired when they wanted problems solved permanently. "Consolidated," Talon said, recognizing the corporate lawyer who had been present at several confrontations between the mining company and territorial authorities. "They're not here to negotiate. They're here to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence." Judge Crawford stood and walked to the window, studying the approaching force with the calm assessment of someone who had faced down angry mobs and corrupt officials throughout his career. "This is still territorial soil, and I am still a representative of territorial law. They cannot simply murder people in front of a federal judge without consequences." "They can, if there are no survivors to testify about what happened," Willow replied grimly. "Consolidated has enough money to buy investigators, coroners, and anyone else who might ask inconvenient questions about what happened at a remote trading post." The corporate force halted about 50 yards from the trading post, close enough to demonstrate their overwhelming numerical superiority, but far enough away to avoid immediate retaliation. The lawyer dismounted and approached the building alone, his hands visible and empty, but his message unmistakable. This was not a negotiation. It was a surrender demand. "Judge Crawford," the lawyer called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "I am Robert Blackwood, legal counsel for Consolidated Mining. I believe you are currently in possession of stolen corporate property, and I'm here to reclaim it on behalf of my clients." Crawford stepped outside, positioning himself where he could be clearly seen while remaining close enough to the building to retreat if necessary. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm currently conducting legal proceedings regarding mineral claims in this territory. If Consolidated Mining has legitimate concerns about these proceedings, they can be addressed through proper legal channels." "No, the people inside that building are fugitives from justice," Blackwood replied. "They have stolen confidential corporate documents and used them to file fraudulent mining claims. We are here to apprehend the criminals and recover our property." Inside the trading post, the small group of defenders was vastly outnumbered, but not without resources. Running Wolf and 3 of his warriors had positioned themselves at strategic points around the building, using the natural cover and defensive positions that the structure provided. The Apache fighters brought a level of tactical expertise that complemented Talon's military knowledge and Willow's intimate familiarity with the terrain. 20 men outside, but they're positioned for intimidation rather than assault, Talon reported, after studying the corporate force through carefully concealed observation points. They expect us to surrender rather than fight, which means they're not prepared for serious resistance. Running Wolf nodded in agreement. White man's war, white man's mistakes. They think numbers and fear are enough to win. They do not understand that some things are worth dying for. Judge Crawford had returned to the building and was studying the tactical situation with growing concern. As a territorial representative, he had limited authority to call for federal assistance, and the nearest military garrison was days away, even if a message could be sent. The legal protection he could offer was meaningless if Consolidated was prepared to commit murder to achieve their objectives. "What are our options?" he asked, addressing the question to Talon as the most experienced military tactician in the group. "Fight or die," Talon replied simply. "Blackwood isn't here to arrest us. He's here to eliminate witnesses to Consolidated's criminal activities. If we surrender, we'll be killed while attempting to escape, and the evidence will disappear along with anyone who could testify about what it contains." Willow was studying the corporate force through the window, noting details that might provide tactical advantages. "They're confident, but they're also impatient. Blackwood is used to intimidating people into submission, and he's not prepared for a prolonged siege. If we can hold out until dark, we might be able to break through their lines and escape. Or we could end this here and now," Running Wolf suggested, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "These men have come to sacred ground with guns and threats. Apache law says they have forfeited their right to safe passage." The confrontation escalated when Blackwood made the mistake of assuming that Judge Crawford could be intimidated as easily as the corrupt local officials that Consolidated usually dealt with. When Crawford refused to hand over the evidence and insisted on following proper legal procedures, Blackwood lost patience and revealed his true intentions. "Judge, you have 60 seconds to produce the fugitives and the stolen documents, or we will assume that you are harboring criminals and act accordingly," Blackwood announced. "Consolidated Mining has legitimate business interests to protect, and we will use whatever force is necessary to protect them." Crawford's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Mr. Blackwood, you are threatening a federal official in the performance of his duties. I suggest you withdraw your men and pursue this matter through appropriate legal channels." The corporate lawyer's facade of legality dropped completely. There are no appropriate legal channels for dealing with thieves and murderers. "Boys, secure the building." The first shots came from the Apache warriors, who had positioned themselves where they could cover the approaches to the trading post while remaining concealed from the corporate force. Running Wolf's rifle spoke, first dropping one of the advancing gunmen before the others could reach effective range. The other warriors followed suit, their coordinated fire disrupting the corporate assault and forcing the attackers to take cover. Talon had positioned himself at the main window, where his rifle could cover the central approach to the building. His first shot took down Blackwood himself, eliminating the corporate leader before he could organize a more effective assault. The remaining corporate gunmen found themselves facing coordinated fire from multiple directions with their opponents, using superior knowledge of the terrain to maintain tactical advantage despite their numerical disadvantage. "They're regrouping for a coordinated assault," Talon reported, watching the corporate force organize itself into more effective tactical formations. Professional gunmen, not just random thugs. "This is going to get serious very quickly." The battle continued for 2 hours, with the corporate force gradually tightening their siege around the trading post, while the defenders used superior marksmanship and tactical positioning to maintain their resistance. But ammunition was running low, and the numerical superiority of their opponents was beginning to tell. It was only a matter of time before Consolidated's men would be able to overwhelm the defensive positions. That was when the unexpected reinforcements arrived. A column of blue uniformed cavalry appeared on the ridge overlooking the trading post, led by a captain who had received a telegraph message from territorial headquarters requesting immediate assistance for a federal judge. Under attack by corporate mercenaries, the arrival of military forces changed the tactical situation completely, turning Consolidated's numerical advantage into a liability. "This is Captain Morrison, United States Cavalry," the officer announced, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "By order of Territorial Command, all hostilities will cease immediately. Anyone found in possession of weapons after this announcement will be considered in violation of federal law." The corporate gunmen found themselves caught between the defending forces in the trading post and a full troop of cavalry on the high ground above them. Resistance was futile, and surrender was their only option for survival. Within minutes, the entire corporate force had laid down their weapons and submitted to military custody. Judge Crawford emerged from the trading post with the portfolio of evidence, presenting it to Captain Morrison as proof of Consolidated Mining's criminal conspiracy. The legal proceedings that followed would eventually result in federal indictments, corporate seizures, and prison sentences for the executives who had ordered the violence. As the dust settled and the prisoners were secured, Talon and Willow found themselves standing outside the trading post where their partnership had begun just days earlier. The mining claims had been filed and certified, the evidence of corporate conspiracy had been preserved, and the immediate threat to their lives had been eliminated. But more importantly, they had proven that people who had been written off as worthless could achieve something that mattered. "So what happens now?" Willow asked, watching the cavalry prepare to escort their prisoners back to territorial headquarters. "Now we become the wealthiest mining partners in Colorado Territory," Talon replied. "But more importantly, we've shown that sometimes the people everyone else dismisses are the ones who end up changing everything." Running Wolf approached them as his warriors prepared to return to their own territory. "The sacred places are safe because of what you did here. Apache people will remember." Judge Crawford was organizing the legal documents that would formalize their mining claims and begin the federal investigation into Consolidated's activities. "Mrs. Steele, Mr. Winspear, you should know that what you accomplished here today goes far beyond filing mining claims. You've exposed a criminal conspiracy that has been operating throughout the territory for years." As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon, Talon realized that something fundamental had changed in how he saw himself and his place in the world. The man who had been sold like damaged goods at this same trading post was now a partner in one of the most valuable mining operations in the territory. But more importantly, he was someone who had found a purpose worth fighting for. "Ready to go home?" Willow asked, using the word that had taken on new meaning for both of them. "Ready," Talon agreed, knowing that they were heading toward a future neither of them could have imagined when their partnership began. The settlement that had grown up around the Winspear Steel Mining Company bore no resemblance to the rough camps that typically sprouted around mineral strikes in the Colorado Territory. Instead of ramshackle saloons and gambling dens, the community featured solid buildings, constructed with an eye toward permanence rather than quick profit. The company's store offered fair prices rather than exploitative credit. The workers' housing was designed for families rather than transient labor, and the mine operations themselves followed safety protocols that prioritized human life over maximum extraction. Talon Winspear sat in his office overlooking the main operation, studying the quarterly reports that showed their unconventional approach to mining was proving as profitable as it was humane. The specialized chair he now used was crafted from fine wood and leather, a far cry from the crude contraptions he had relied on during their desperate flight through the mountains. But more importantly, it was a symbol of adaptation rather than limitation, proof that physical challenges could be overcome through ingenuity and determination. The new safety equipment arrived from Denver this morning, Willow announced as she entered the office, carrying a manifest that detailed the latest shipment of protective gear for their miners. Full breathing apparatus for the deep shafts, reinforced support timbers rated for the heaviest loads, and enough emergency supplies to last through any winter storm. Their partnership had evolved far beyond the desperate alliance forged in an abandoned cabin. What had begun as mutual survival had grown into something that neither corporate law nor territorial custom had adequate words to describe. They were business partners, certainly, but also something deeper, a bond forged in shared struggle and sealed by mutual respect that transcended conventional relationships. The mining operation they had built together was generating wealth that exceeded even their most optimistic projections from those early days of surveying and claim filing. But the true measure of their success was not found in ledger books or bank statements. It was visible in the faces of the people who worked for them and the communities that had grown up around their operations. The sound of a single horse, approaching at a measured pace, drew Talon's attention to the window. Visitors were common now that their operation had established a reputation for both profitability and fair dealing, but there was something familiar about the silhouette of the rider that made him study the approaching figure more carefully. When recognition finally came, it brought with it a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "It's Judge Crawford," he called to Willow, who was reviewing work schedules for the following week. "And he's alone, which probably means this isn't an official visit." Judge Samuel Crawford had aged well in the 2 years since the confrontation at Devil's Canyon Trading Post. The federal investigation that had grown out of the evidence they provided had made him something of a legend among territorial officials. The judge who had faced down corporate corruption and lived to see justice served. His reputation had earned him a promotion to the territorial Supreme Court, but it had also made him enemies among the powerful interests that preferred their business conducted in shadows. "Mr. Winspear, Mrs. Steele," Crawford said as he dismounted in the yard outside their office. "I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit, but I have some news that I thought you should hear directly from me rather than through official channels." They welcomed him into the office and offered the hospitality that mountain custom demanded, but his expression suggested that this was not a social call. Crawford accepted a cup of coffee and settled into a chair before delivering the news that had brought him across 200 miles of rough country. Consolidated Mining Corporation has been dissolved by federal order, he announced. The criminal trials concluded last month with convictions for conspiracy, fraud, and murder. The corporate assets have been seized and will be sold to compensate the families of their victims. The news was satisfying, but not surprising. The evidence they had preserved had been so comprehensive that the federal prosecutors had been able to build cases that no amount of corporate money could dismiss or delay. Justice had been slow, but it had also been thorough. "But that's not why I came," Crawford continued. "I came because the territorial governor has asked me to make you both an offer." The offer that Crawford presented was both flattering and challenging, an opportunity to expand their influence far beyond the mining operation they had built. In the mountains, The territorial government was planning a comprehensive reform of mining regulations, labor protections, and corporate oversight, and they wanted the Windspear Steel Partnership to serve as consultants in developing the new legal framework. Your operation has become a model for ethical mining practices throughout the West, Crawford explained. Every territorial official who has visited your facilities has come away impressed by what you've accomplished. The governor believes that your experience could help prevent other consolidated-type situations from developing. Willow and Talon exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. The opportunity to influence territorial policy was appealing, but it would also mean spending time away from the mountain community they had worked so hard to build. More importantly, it would thrust them into the kind of political arena where their unconventional partnership might become a liability rather than an asset. What exactly would be expected of us? Willow asked. 6 months in Denver, working with legislative committees and regulatory agencies to draft new mining laws. Your practical experience would be invaluable in creating regulations that actually protect workers and communities rather than just looking good on paper. So, that evening, as they discussed Crawford's offer over dinner in the house they had built on the ridge overlooking their mining operation, both of them understood that they were facing a decision that would define the next phase of their lives, together. The choice was not just about accepting or declining a government appointment. It was about deciding whether their partnership had grown strong enough to survive the challenges of a larger stage. "Do you want to do it?" Talon asked, studying Willow's face in the lamplight. "Part of me does," she admitted. "The chance to prevent other families from going through what Tom and I experienced, to create laws that actually protect people instead of corporations. That's appealing. But I'm also worried about what we might lose in the process." "What do you mean?" "This," she said, gesturing toward the window that looked out over their thriving community. "What we've built here is more than just a successful business. It's proof that people can choose to do things differently, that profit doesn't have to come at the expense of human dignity." Talon nodded, understanding her concern. The mining operation they had created was indeed more than a business. It was a demonstration that ethical practices could be both profitable and sustainable. Leaving it, even temporarily, carried risks that went beyond mere financial considerations. "But maybe that's exactly why we should go," he said after a long moment of consideration. "If we can help create laws that make what we've done here the standard rather than the exception, the impact could be enormous." 3 months later, as they prepared for their departure to Denver, Talon found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them from a desperate auction at Devil's Canyon to a position of influence in territorial affairs. The transformation was remarkable not just in external circumstances, but in how he saw himself and his place in the world. The man who had once been sold like damaged goods was now being asked to help write the laws that would govern an entire territory. The woman who had been willing to risk everything to honor her dead husband's memory was now recognized as one of the most innovative mining engineers in the West. Together, they had proven that people who are written off by society often have the most valuable contributions to make. "Ready?" Willow asked, adjusting the pack that contained the documents and plans they would present to the territorial legislature. "Ready," Talon replied, knowing that whatever challenges awaited them in Denver, they would face them as they had faced everything else together. As their wagon rolled down the mountain road toward the territorial capital, the community they had built continued its daily work behind them. The Windspear Steel Mining Company would continue to operate according to the principles they had established, but their influence was now expanding beyond the boundaries of a single valley. They had become living proof that the most powerful partnerships are forged not in boardrooms or government offices, but in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual respect. The paralyzed Nootka scout and the mountain woman who had sworn to protect him had become something neither of them had ever imagined possible. They had become the architects of a better future, built on the foundation of their unbreakable bond. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.